Good evening. My name's Pamela. I'm happy to see all of you. And I'm a firm believer that everything that happens to you in life, no matter how bizarre, somehow prepares you for whatever comes next. So I'm an HR director for a commodities trading company. And there's a bestseller in the works there when the statute of limitations on telling tales out of school runs out. And people often ask me, so how did you learn everything about HR? And how did you get prepared for that? And the best preparation that I had to become an HR person was working in a call center for the airlines in the 1980s. So back before Al Gore invented the internet, if you wanted to go to Europe, the only way to get there was to call me or one of my 200 colleagues and book a ticket online. Call us up, 800 number, 200 crazy people, and we would preferably get you from here to Europe, wherever it was your destination was. But you had to call between 7 in the morning and 11 at night, because round about 10 to 11, there was a queue of waiting calls, 10, 15, 20 calls, and we weren't allowed to close the office until 11 o'clock, and all the calls were gone. But it was usually airline night at the Dublin pub, and we had to get there by 11:30, or the free drink specials with your airline ID ran out. So at 10 to 11, I have to admit that I would answer your call and put you on hold and then transfer you to the Pizza Kings down the street. So the call was out of the queue, and then the Pizza Kings would answer, and they go, "Hello, Pizza Kings," and you thought you were, wait a minute, I was just finding out how much it cost to go to Germany. Sorry, call back tomorrow, because when you called back, the place was closed, and I was waiting for my free drink. So airline folks in general are nomadic. They are culturally curious. They often have lived around the world. They often speak multiple languages. They are spontaneous. They are fun. They are eclectic. And they are unsuitable for any other job. You have a wonderful collection of misfits working in an airline call center. You've got moms who this is convenient for their schedule. You've got a whole theater crowd that needs to pay the rent somehow. You've got college kids. In this case, I was a recently graduated college kid. And you've got folks who are either too old now to fly the plane or too old to serve on the plane, but they still love the flight benefits piece. And so you've got this interesting group of people, and we work shift work. And the call center is set up in such a way that you've got rows of tables with computers on them and telephones. Big, bulky computers like they had in the late 80s that are bigger than television and giant boxes. And there's no privacy between people. There's no walls or anything else. You all sit there, and you're attached to your telephone. And you have to take 100 calls a day. You know, airline reservations, this is Pamela, may I help you? And I don't do that well. For folks who know me at all, I'm kind of a bubbly wise ass. And I don't sit in my seat well. And I don't certainly take 100 calls well. So we were kind of governed by these 9 supervisors of Germanic descent. Doesn't go well with bubbly wise ass. So anyway, some of these supervisors are great. They're easy to work with. They're reasonable. They're fun. They're second or third generation Americans, so they're okay, and we're good, and we can get along with them. And then you got a couple of the old schoolers, and there was one in particular, and I'll call her Helga, and she was scary. This is 25 years later, and I'm still scared of her. So she was built like a linebacker. She was taller than I was, built like Zoftig German Hausfrau, and she had the countenance of your mother in a bad mood. And I was always getting in trouble. So all day long I'd hear, "Pamela, get back in your seat! Why aren't you taking calls?" And I'm like, oh God, again? I don't want to sit in my seat. I don't want to take them. Okay, all right, fine. So I worked out a system, and I talked faster. I'm from Long Island. That comes naturally. But I got it down to an average call time of 1:36. So I got through my 100 calls in the first 3-4 hours. That gave me plenty of time to socialize, except when I was working late shifts with Helga. So we'd work 3 to 11. Now, I had a very crazy friend, Johnny, at the time. Johnny is a very, very dear friend of mine to this day, and he used to live with me for a couple of years. Johnny was very eclectic, spoke 8 languages fluently, lived around the world, had a lovely cottage industry where he married women from other parts of the world, brought them to the United States, turned them into U.S. citizens, and divorced them. And he had the most delicious 900 number phone voice you would ever hear. Airline reservations. This is Johnny. May I help you? And that wasn't just his airline voice. That was his voice, right? We'd be sitting at my house drinking wine and making sauce, and he'd be like, hand me more tomatoes. Pour me another glass, right? So anyway, so I'm living with Johnny, and Johnny's a little wacky. Just to give you an example how wacky Johnny is, in order to make, I'd recently broken up with my boyfriend, and I therefore needed someone to room with me, and Johnny was the person who was going to room with me. So he moves in his first morning living there. We're getting ready to leave for work, and I hear this loud clanking sound, and I'm like, what the heck is that, Johnny? What is that sound? And he's walking out the door, kind of like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, and making a lot of noise. I'm like, Johnny. He goes, I was very afraid that your boyfriend, Frank, the cop, was going to be very upset with me for moving in. Do you like my vest? And he shows me that he has strapped together frying pans and lids from the kitchen to make a bulletproof vest on both sides of his body. And this is my friend Johnny. And I'm like, take that thing off. Okay. So anyway, so one night, finishing a 3 to 11, stint, and we're home, and it wasn't airline night, so we're sitting there with the sauce and the wine and the everything else, and Johnny shows me that he's just been home from a trip to New Orleans, and he bought a kit to make a voodoo doll. And I'm like, Johnny, you genius! This is great! Who are we going to make a voodoo doll? This is awesome! Who are you going to do? And he's like, Helga. And you're going to help. I'm like, me? I can't help. I'm going to get caught. No, this isn't going to work. And he's like, you silly woman. I can't do everything. I have to sew the doll. You have to retrieve the hair. And I'm like, oh, God, I'm dead. So, of course, the next day I have to go into work, and I have to go into the coat closet with a Ziploc bag and a pair of tweezers. And I find the beautiful Chanel coat that she would wear. It's black and white houndstooth print, gorgeous. And I'm hoping to God that the hairs that I'm pulling from the shoulders are hers and not some victim that she disposed of. As I put them into the bag, and I bring them home, and I'm nervous, and I'm like, Johnny, I did it. I got him. He's like, very well. And we sat there that night, and he carefully sewed the little muslin doll with the sugar and spice and everything nice and the little hairs, and he made a little black and white houndstooth coat for it and little slingback shoes. And he dressed it all up, and he said, and now we'll try it out. And I'm like, oh, God. So the next day, sure enough, we go to work, and Helga had this habit at the end of the evening, when most of the shifts would end, would be around 7 o'clock. So between 7 and 11, it was a skeleton crew. About 15 agents or so out of a room that really had 200 people in it. So she would line the however, 10 or so agents into the 2 rows in front of her, so where she sat in her supervisor's perch, she could glare at all of them with that countenance of, right? So there we are, we're sitting there and working, and, and he slides out the voodoo doll. And he's looking up at her, and I'm looking up at her, and he goes, and she twitches. And I'm like, airline reservations, this is Pamela, can I help you? And he's like, airline reservations, this is Johnny. Because he's so freaking smooth, right? And she goes, Pamela, come here! And I'm like, oh, God, she's going to catch me. And I go up to the front, I'm like, yes, Helga? She's like, why aren't you taking calls? What are you laughing at? I'm like, I'm not laughing. And I go back to my seat, and I go sit down, and I look at Johnny, and he goes, with a little wry smile. And about 10, 15 minutes later, he slides out the voodoo doll and does it again. And sure enough, she twitches. And I'm like, now I'm laughing, because I can't help it, right? It's hilarious. Here's this woman I can't stand. It reminds me like I'm working for my mother. And there she is. I'm finally getting back at her. He's doing it, but I'm enjoying it. And she's twitching. But, I get called again. Pamela? And I'm like, I've heard my name called more times in this job than I had in my life up until then. I go back up, and this time Johnny comes to my aid, and he's got the doll. And she's like, why aren't you taking calls? What is the matter? You need... And I'm like, are you okay, Helga? She's like, get in your seat! And I'm like, "Oh, okay," and I run back to my seat, and I'm sitting there, finally sitting there looking, and I look at Johnny, and Johnny looks at me, and he goes, "It works." Thank you very much.